now? Yes, okay, everyone, yes, okay, perfect. First of all, I would like to, on behalf of Gender Island Futures research group, we would like to welcome you to the first Caring for the Future webinar. Today, we have the honor of having Helene Pristed Nielsen as our very first guest, and I will introduce her in a short while. We would like to, no, first of all, I want to let you in on the catalyst for this quarterly online seminar. It is GIF's intention, that's our short name for Gender Island Futures, to produce knowledge in collaboration with written theoretical texts as a usual way of producing knowledge, but also to collaborate closely with local people, participants in our research, local stakeholders, and international fellow academics. We find it important and enriching to bring early empirical knowledge, thoughts, and wonderings into life with other scholars that think in the same lines, or perhaps challenge these lines. In other words, we wish to create a research network, or an academic kin, if you like, as our PI said. While GIF is especially interested in motherhood and change through intergenerational relations, everyday life, and imaginations, there are some overall themes that many of us share, even though it's not specifically motherhood or generations. We wish to endorse a space where we can discuss overall shared themes of caring for the future from various focal points, and hope that you will embark on this journey with us. The next Caring for the Future's webinar is on the 25th of April, and again on the 27th of June. Before I present our very first guest, I want to briefly describe the outline and the frame of the webinar. We have set aside 1 hour for this talk, and it begins with a presentation from Helene for approximately 30 minutes. And the latter half of the webinar will be an open floor where reflective questions, thoughts, and discussions are welcome. We hope this to be a space where we can explore, reflect, and challenge shared academic interests in the matter of reproduction, parenthood, intimate lives, and change. As the organizers, we will lead the webinar and manage the time frame to our very best capacity, as well as have initial and prepared questions for our guest. Now to presenting our guest. We've been so fortunate that Helene Pristed Nielsen has agreed to join us today and share with us reflections from her research. Helene is a sociologist and gender researcher, now working in the Navy, and now striving for the Navy to be a happy and fair workplace. Helene has written about the connection between female outmigration from remote rural areas, gender segregation in the labor market, and inequalities in access to jobs and education opportunities. And it is within this field that the discussion will depart. Helene has also greatly contributed to research on islands and gender through the different lenses of migration, love, and affection, in which she has co-edited the book Gender and Islands with Professor Peter Scaini. Helene's research interests are therefore wide-ranging as she sees how these seemingly separated issues intersect, which is also why we're very pleased and excited that she has agreed to join us for our very first webinar. The thematic issue of today will circulate around gender and futures in terms of making and placing children into the world, kinning and dekinning, and creating the future of individuals, families, clans, and societies. And with no further ado, the floor is yours, Helene.
Oh, thank you very much. I think perhaps the most interesting, not interesting, but most relevant piece of information about me today is that I have tonsillitis. So if my voice sounds really weird, I'm on penicillin and everything, but I've been really looking forward to today. So I wanted to go through with this presentation because I was so inspired when I received your invitation for it. So let me see if I can share my slides with you. See how this works. No, not really. That's not what I wanted to share. I'll just show and then let's see if I can share the version where I'm only showing my slides. Not really, no.
But can you press that on the bottom, and it should be this like presentation view. There's like, yeah, that one.
Maybe, oh,
Does
yeah,
that work?
now it works, right? You see my slides and only my slides. Great. Right.
Only the
So
slides.
good. So like I said, I was really inspired when Turid first wrote to me and asked me if I would do a presentation. I also want to comment on the fact that in your sort of invitation or the blurb for this seminar series, you say you invite scholars. Well, I think it's maybe questionable whether I can still call myself a scholar. I work as a special advisor to the Navy about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I have in the past, actually even in the past month, also published on issues relating to mobility, gendered migration, gendered divisions in the labor market, and especially how this is connected to sort of small or peripheral places. I don't like those terms, but I will get back to discussing that. Like Turid said in the presentation just now, one of the themes you would be interested in the series is this question of gendered futures in terms of making and placing children in the world, kinning, dekinning, creating the future of individuals, families, clans, and societies. And one of the things that I was really also inspired by what if in your blurb was this idea that you wanted to explore how temporalities intersect with reproduction, gender, parenthood, and care. So I've highlighted the words temporality, intersection, gender, parenthood, because those are some of the themes I want to discuss today. I'm not going to say anything about reproduction and care, although I think they are super sort of implicit in everything that will come from me today, right? So my puzzle, when I started to think about, so how could I, as a sort of, I don't know, former scholar or not so active anymore scholar, try and say something new in a workshop, although I'm not really working on these issues at the moment. But it came to me when I was thinking over towards invitation here that one of the questions that arose in my head when thinking through some of the previous work I've done was this question that why do so many of the people I've interviewed over the years experience their local, often coastal or island gender roles, especially in relation to the labor market, as fixed, when history clearly shows that they're constantly changing? So why is it that people I've interviewed in these sort of peripheral or sort of remote or whatever you want to call them areas, why is it that they see local gender roles, especially in the labor market, as something not open for negotiation? So I know my paper from 2018 was circulated along with the invitation for this presentation. I'm going to say I'm going to attach a few words to that, but I'm actually also going to focus much more on a more recent paper from 2021 called En køn historie. If you understand Danish, you will appreciate the pun, right? It's both a gendered story, but it's also something being a pretty mess. But just a few words first about my paper from 2018. Something you can't read out of the paper, but which is, I think, an interesting background story for understanding where that paper comes from, is that it was, I wonder if I should use the word inspired. Actually, I was furious. I read a consultation report from big Danish, I think maybe Kobe or something, advising the region of North Denmark about how to attract more settlers. And the consultants had made this picture, which you see in the slide, which is supposed to illustrate how many workplaces you can access within an hour's car drive from each of these locations. And I was looking at that map and I think, you know, stupid consultants, like how what are you not seeing here, right? Because I was born and raised in southern Denmark, so of course I know that just because the Danish CVR register doesn't show as many companies that you can access within an hour from, say, Sønderborg or Tønder or wherever, it doesn't mean that there are no companies in Germany. Of course, you commute across the border. It's not the end of the world, right? So I was thinking, how stupid can consultants be, right? And I also wondered about, how much money they earn. Now that I am a consultant myself, I can tell you more than you do at universities, right? So, and apparently there's no sort of, there doesn't seem to be much demand for thinking, right? For critical thinking. But then actually being so provoked by this picture, I went back and looked at the picture of the region of North Denmark, and I thought to myself, all right, so the difference is that the borders around the region of North Denmark, that's all water, right? But people also commute there. There are also jobs at sea. So how is that maybe different, or how does that somehow perhaps impact the kind of working life or the kind of future you could imagine for yourself in these kinds of areas? So that got me curious, right? And that's actually sort of curiosity, as you well know, of course, is what drives any researcher, right? So I was curious, what is it like to live in one of those red towns on the map where supposedly there are no jobs, nowhere to commute to? What do you do then if that's where you feel at home? So and then the next inspirational thing, of course, was that living in this region myself, it was really hard to miss the fact that in 2011 and again in 2012, this town Hirtshals on the northwest coast was visited by two different Maersk oil rigs, which were in the harbor for approximately 100 days each. Huge, like you wouldn't believe. You could see them from a distance when you were driving towards town. They were lying there. It was really making an impact, right? It was a very visual sort of sense that here was work, right? And Hirtshals is a town with approximately 6,000 inhabitants. Those two oil rigs, they had 800 workers on them, working day and night for 100 days, and most people had, very, very few, if any, days off while they were there, right? And apart from the 800 people who worked on the rigs, repairing them, making them ready to go out to sea again, there were all these auxiliary functions, like people in catering and hotels and whatnot, who earned a lot of money trying to accommodate all these workers. So I use that as a sampling point to get interviewees, right? And also as a way to sort of question, is Hirtshals really, at the periphery of Denmark, or is it maybe at the center of? I found this illustration from an organization called Maritime, or what's it called? But it's an organization for maritime cooperation, right? And there is, they say, of course, Hirtshals is not the periphery of Denmark, it's the center of the Scandinavian triangle, right? So, of course, it's a question of whether you imagine the sea as a kind of boundary, or whether you imagine it as something that, potentially brings people together, is a way of exchanging new possibilities, for example. So the article, I don't know if you read it, and I'm not going to dwell a lot on it, but some of the key points from the article is that it discusses how gender, place, and generation are being negotiated in the context of flexible work. For some of the interviewees, changing conditions, increasing demands and expectations for education, mobility, flexibility, entail that they simply can't envision a future for their own children in the local place. And I think that is really interesting. I'm that got me wondering, why is it that these were mostly men? Why is it that these men don't see a good future for their children in this place, right? Another sort of thing which you can't read in the paper, which is a funny kind of background story also, is that as you probably know, when you receive research grants, there's no way you're gonna, put beer in a bar on a grant budget but I had pleaded with our local secretary at the university to say, could I please, if I meet, because I could see on Facebook that these men I wanted to talk to who'd been working on these rigs, they were hanging out at a particular bar in Hirtshals. So I said to her, could I hang out at the bar and could I maybe buy them a beer and tap the bill to the project? So I really negotiated this. And of course, in the end, none of these men wanted a beer from me, right? I must have been crazy, right? Because they were earning heaps of money, right? They were really, it would have been, for them, I'm sure it would have been sort of, well, it was out of the question to receive beer from a woman and from a university like me, who probably, I don't know, earned a quarter of what they did or whatever, right? So in many ways they were really successful, right? And that made me wonder, why is it when they actually, in terms of income, in terms of the experiences they have, the kind of global sort of all this traveling, why is it that they don't see this as an attractive option for their kids? So I can see from my interview material that many of the people I interviewed, and of course, here it's important to remember that I sampled my interviewees based on the fact that they somehow had work in relation to these rig upholdings, right? So they were presumably flexible already, right? So these people were super flexible also both in terms of temporality, but also in terms of geography. And I could see that many of their decisions about when to move, where to move, was really sort of tightly interwoven with concerns for family commitment, both to the spouses and their children, but also, and that was something I hadn't sort of considered in advance, but also very much in relation to aging parents and wanting to be near aging parents. So despite the fact that the people I interviewed, they themselves sort of expressed family ties as really important, either directly or indirectly, they all also, or not all, but most of them said things like, I don't imagine my children will stay here. They will not. And being really proud about, one of them had a son who had started to train as a civil engineer, and he was so proud of that and really hoping that he would stay far away from the local area and far away from the kinds of jobs that his father had. So I think, I ended up sort of building these two different types of pictures towards the end of the article, which are kind of hypothetical, but which I want to sort of play along with in the second half of my presentation. So one idea is that the research I have been reading about peripheral labor markets from Norway, from Sweden, and also actually there's a lot of this also from Ireland, Scotland, places like that. Is this idea that when people live in such places, they often will have multi-jobbing to sort of make sure that they create an income somehow, which often leads to a relatively low income, and also often perhaps too little emphasis on formal education, but also very importantly to place attachment across generations. So I call this pattern in the article the sedentary, simultaneous, non-specialized multi-jobbing. So those people who stay in place and at the same time have different types of jobs which are not necessarily requiring a very high level of education. Right? And that contrasts with the people I interviewed, most of the people I interviewed for this oil rig uphaul project where, of course, I had deliberately sampled those people who would actually venture into that kind of opportunity, right? And I ended up calling them a kind of bungee jumpers, right? Because what they were was that they turned to, they had really specialized jobs, right? They were often like super technical, details about oil rigs or about safety, security. Um, so they had also relatively high incomes, and also a very big emphasis on education, specialized education, and potentially less place attachment across generations, or at least um, it seemed to me that they validated formal education to an extent where they saw it as necessary for the kids to move, right? Um, so that they had, in contrast to the first pattern, the pattern 2 is much more mobile. It's much more serial, and specialized and consecutive jobs, but they are also bungee jumpers in the sense that they are super tightly tied to their place of origin, all of the people I interviewed, right? It's not that they just were sort of completely wandering off. What is Bauman's expression? He calls it the tourists and the vagabonds, right? So Bauman has this idea, right, that the very successful on the global labor market will just wander wherever and not be attached anywhere. But that wasn't the case for these people, right? If they saw an opportunity to come back home and work, they would do that, right? So they were tied to their place of origin, but also wanting specialized jobs and more demanding types of jobs. The other article that I want to say a few words about, because I want to think about the differences essentially, right? Or actually invite you to think with me about the differences, is this article from 2021 called A Køn Historie, which is a tiny little article in Jordens Folk, which I believe is even published by your department, right, Nana? Yeah. I think here the story is quite different, right? Because my starting point for data collection was the place, right? So it's completely flipped around, right? So I started with the place-based criteria for interviewing people, right? And Lesser, I don't know if you're familiar with it, is home to about 1,800 people, and situated in the sea between Denmark and Sweden, just far enough from the coast for it to be, well, if not impossible, at least really tedious to commute to Denmark, to mainland Denmark for a job. You would have to leave super early in the morning and come home like 12, 13 hours later, right? So there are really some limited possibilities on the island in terms of the labor market. Also, it is very sort of, there's a very clear pattern that young people, and especially young women, are leaving the island. And I think some of I mean, it carries with it many of these sort of small community issues that you also see in other island societies, right? I think it's encapsulated here. This was a teenager who said this to me at the bottom of the slide. The best thing about living on Lesser is that everybody knows everybody. But the worst thing about living on Lesser is also that everybody knows everybody, right? So that's the kind of community. And I think it's interesting how Lesser, as a place of growing up, as a place of having children, is in a way a place you have to leave, right? The school includes the 9th grade, which means that when you're 15, 16 years old, you really have to leave the island, right? There's no way you can stay. Previously, people my generation, if they wanted to go into fishing and farming, I interviewed some of those, they could actually stay back then. But even now, the sort of education system has been formalized to an extent where you can't even become a fisher without having go to formal education in Thyborøn or Skagen or somewhere, right? So there's this sort of out migration for kids who want to go to gymnasium or efterskole or whatever. They leave the island after ninth grade. And of course, that also has some upsides to it. Like an elderly lady who said to me, there are no boys on Læsø who can't wash their clothes, wash their own clothes when they're 15, right? So there's also, on one hand, this story that, yes, that is a little bit sad, but on the other hand, also this pride that we are growing, we are raising kids who are independent and strong and fit for standing on their own 2 feet, right? And I've been digging into some historical sources on Læsø because that started intriguing me, right? Because it's interesting. Of course, it's always been like this, except it's been gendered in different ways previously, right? I found an account from 1895 where this guy talks about the boys from Læsø, and boys only, mind you. As soon as they pass confirmation age, the majority of Læsø boys goes to Copenhagen to some lodging house where the parents have stayed before them and where the host is sometimes a former Læsø resident and then hire for long distance shipping, either directly or from England. So there's always been this tendency, especially for the boys to leave, right? But now it's everybody, right? Because we also currently expect women, young women, to also get an education and get a job, right? And as one of the mothers on Læsø said to me, if you think that's a nuisance, you shouldn't have children on Læsø. We sometimes see people who move with their children. We will not do that, she said so very expressly, right? They should do it on their own, right? So, and I think it's interesting how, I mean, Læsø is not unique in this sense, but it's interesting how Læsø is one of those communities where historically there's been a very strongly gendered division of labor, where the men have been at sea, and so the women have been farming. And of course, in much of the rest of Denmark, that would have been unusual. There's a really interesting book by Bjarne Stoklund, who was a local historian on Læsø, called Work and Gender Roles on Læsø from 1200 to 1900, where he goes through this. Yeah, he's very diligent. He has some really interesting accounts. And of course, I mean, the reason for what was going on Læsø was that the men were off sailing and they were somehow unreliable, right? Would they come back? Would they survive? When would they come back? So the women were actually taking over farming, and also actually taking over. They ended up having matrilineal inheritance of farms, right? So I really like this account from 1858 from this district physician who talks about these Læsø women. They've been forced by circumstance to take over all occupations in the house, field, and heath. Rule outside as well as inside have become self-willed, and due to their often difficult physical exertion and inappropriate occupations, not a little lost the healthy femininity in being and way of thinking. So he's talking about how these women are becoming manly, right? And also there's a travel account from a newspaper from 1887 who describes that even if the men are at home during winter, they don't actually participate in running in the farm. And then there's this description of how they're strolling around to visit friends and acquaintances wearing black suits and armed with silk umbrellas, right? So they are, the men are also somehow demasculinized, right? By these Copenhagen news, these are a report from a Copenhagen newspaper. So I think this is really funny. And I think Stoklund explains how from around 1750 to around 1880, they had, women were by far a majority on the island, unlike today where the women are in the minority. So the there have definitely been some changes, right, over the years. But it's interesting then when I interviewed people who were living on Lesser when I was there in the winter of 2019, it really intrigues me um, how people see when I ask them about work and job possibilities for staying on the island, finding a job or making a job for oneself. A lot of the people just don't, I mean, they see it as extremely static, right? Some of the young people I interviewed, for example, one of them said, well, my brother's an electrician and he stayed on the island, right? And she was wanting to move away, and I asked her, well, couldn't you become an electrician? And she was like, oh, but I see that as a man's job, right? And she was just not sort of reflecting on it. And then I thought this was also I really, this is actually one of the quotes from my research sort of back catalog that I still use when in my current work in the Navy. This quote from this young girl who talks about getting a job she wants, right? I just want something where I get up in the morning and think, yes, I'm going to work. It's so damn important to me. Someone like my mom, she's like, oh, I don't want to go. She can complain for like half an hour that she has to go to work. And I want to get up in the morning and say, yes. Okay. So, and she doesn't think that those types of jobs are available on Leslie, right? Those types of jobs that would, make her feel in the morning, yes, I'm going to work. Then, of course, there's also the question of, is Leslie a nice place to raise a family? And a lot of people actually do think it is, right? Um, although Dr. Rasmussen, whom we met in the previous quote, he's a little bit concerned, right? With few exceptions, the sense of coziness in the home is as good as foreign to them, and consequently, the relationship and the family life less fortunate, right? Um, because the women are working too much in his sort of understanding, right? But actually, the people I interviewed on Leslie saw it as an extremely nice place to raise children, right? It was cozy, safe. The word safety, feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling that the kids were looked after. Just went through a lot of the interview material. I put at the corner of the slide there, I put the opening hours from the local police station, which I took a picture of when I was there. As you see, I thought that was really funny, right? It's open Tuesdays from 11 in the morning to noon, and then Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m., right? And that's it, right? And I talked to the local settlement consultant who was, she was trying to attract more settlers to the island. And she said to me, you know what, I'm thinking about putting in our next brochure that the crime rate has gone up 200%. And then she looked at me and then she said, I know it doesn't sound logical, but you know what happened? We went from one burglary to two last year. So so there's really the sense that it's a nice place, right, to raise a family, although the kids have to leave when they're 15 or 16. So I think I think that ideas about gender divisions of labor, who should have which types of jobs, who should till the land, inherit the farm, ideas about good working lives, ideas about good family lives, ideas about finding suitable spouses. I haven't said anything about that, but there's a little bit in the article about that. I think such ideas have presumably always interacted with the possibilities and characteristics of any local place, right? But because Lesser is precisely an island, it seems that this interaction between gender roles and expectations on the one hand and the place on the other is, I don't know if it's more pronounced, but perhaps just easier to spot, right? Because what this guy, oh, forget his first name, but Gillis, he made this claim that islands are good to think with, right? Because they somehow it's intuitive for us to see, you know, where does the land start, where the water start, and somehow it's an enclosed sort of environment, and you can sort of observe what's going on. Of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't interactions going on, but it seems perhaps more pronounced or easier to identify that these negotiations are going on, because there's this really strong decision to move, right? If you move from an island, the island doesn't have a bridge, in many cases, moving from an island or to an island will put a demand on you to have sort of capacity for mobility, right? Which I think, unless you manage to sort of get all your needs fulfilled in the local place, there is just a different sort of capacity for mobility needed if you settle in a place like that, right? And so I was thinking about Forsberg's theory about local gender contracts. And I mean, she is she's interested. I mean, she points out how there can be sort of more sort of conservative ideas about which jobs are suitable for men and suitable for women in different parts of different places, right? But I think it's also really important to underline that when Forsberg talks about a gender contract, any contract actually also means that you can negotiate, right? There has been a negotiation, and there must be a negotiation continuously over time. And I think one of the things that is really becomes really sort of obvious when looking at places like Lesser, and there are many other similar places across the world, right, is that that if the contract is not negotiated, the young women will negotiate with their feet, right? They will walk away, and that's a sort of definitive, perhaps a more maybe we can discuss this. I wonder if it's a more definitive move if you leave from an island, right? So I think as I said in the beginning, what puzzles me here is when you look at the history, when you look at the types of jobs of many of the people I've interviewed are completely original and super, you know, they put together their working lives in new and original ways, and somehow reinvent themselves in terms of their jobs. And nevertheless, most people I talk to, even if they themselves personally have managed to put together what I would think was a very sort of innovative and new approach to finding an income in a sort of coastal or island place, they still see the labor market as fixed. And I think what I want to end with this slide and open for debate, but I want to end with this little interchange between two 14-year-old girls whom I interviewed together in a focus group interview together with a few boys as well. And one of the girls says, maybe I would like to become a fashion designer, but there are no designers here. And then her friend says, well, it would just be so cool if you were to be the first fashion designer on Lesser, right? So you know, you can have these imaginations, but somehow I don't know what's going on. That's what I wanted to ask you all about, actually. So I guess I'll just shut up and ask for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Helene. Thank you so much for this. That was very intriguing. And I think we should do it in the way. So I would love to see you also. I can see the hands, because I'm thinking that if you guys know how to like raise a hand on the like with the like an animation hand, then we should do it like that, even though I'm searching for it right now. But if you guys know how to do it, then maybe, yeah, no, you should just stay on that slide and actually. So and then we can and then I can like you know, say the name of the first hand that I see, and then you can unmute yourself. Should we do it like that? So welcome to share thoughts, ask questions, reflect, comment.
But you would like me to still share the slide, right?
I think maybe that would be great, because then we can, like, if we need to return. Nana has the first hand.
Okay. Hi, Helene. Thank you so much for coming to share with us in this first seminar, and for sharing something which is so close to many of the debates, I think, in anthropology at the moment, but also specifically in our project about gender and islands and the future, and imagining the futures. One question that I am really concerned with in our project, and that you mentioned, that I think I would like you to say a little bit more about just the empirical experiences, but maybe also your considerations of labor and the gender contracts and how it's negotiated. It is this thing that when you live in a small island community, but also maybe in the coastal peripheries, the assumption is that you have to move away. So what does it mean for parenting in a modern welfare society like this is, when you have to leave? You said jokingly that the boys know how to wash your own clothes, but what are the more what are the strategies that you hear parents or children use in terms of how do we interact, how do we manage distance or closeness in our relationships? How do we parent? Because for many of us, we do not think parenting has ended when children are 15 or even 18. So can you speak a little bit to that? Because this is something that I'm very interested in learning more about.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That is actually, you know what, that is actually one of the really interesting things about my current job, because that's what I'm debating also with my employers in the Danish Navy, right? Because our staff, they are on board these ships, right? And we really need them to keep sailing, even when they have kids, right? But there's also this expectation from society, I think in many respects, that parenting also has to do with being close, in close proximity, right? And can you be in close proximity without being geographically close to each other, right? And I think I think one of the studies that keep coming back to me, which is actually from the Faroe Islands, which I'm sure you will appreciate, right? It's a study by Jester Haugård, which was published in 2015, I believe, where he interviewed long-distance sailors from the Faroe Islands, who would typically be away from their homes for 6 months at a time, right? And then home or maybe 3 months, and then 3 months home, and so 6 months over the year, right? And one of the things he found when he interviewed them about fathering and about being fathers and having that kind of job. And one of the things he found was that, especially if they have teenage children, they turned out to have quite often quite close relations with their kids, because they would be constantly on social media, right? Because they were super bored on board these ships. So they would be on social media between harbors. And then, of course, when they were in harbor, they would be busy, right? And not, but otherwise they had a really, so you can actually compensate for something, right, by being online. There's also studies of Danish soldiers being on missions, and being online and having close. There's some studies about veteran fathers, who then share particular stories with their kids. There's a study by and Dorte Christensen, Morten Kyd, and Helene Oldrup, I think she's called, where they show how some of the strategies, for example, if the kids are younger, you get two teddy bears and one goes with the parent and one goes with the kid, and then they share these stories. So there's a lot of stories about how sort of digital mediatized sort of parenting can be a proxy for some of these issues. Then, of course, the thing is about the Navy is that we don't want the Russian U-boats to be able to spot us, so our staff cannot be online. And then that's the next thing, right? But yeah, that's another detail, right? But we do have real issues with it. This actually, it's easier for people working in the army than in the Navy to be online when they're at work. But that's a different story. Yeah, I saw some other questions, I think. Oh, yeah, and I know, I should have noticed your name, right? Actually, some of it is your work, right?
Yeah, it is. The article with the teddy bears. That's
yeah, exactly. That's
my...
where yeah, it wasn't Helene Arnold. It's yours. It's yours, right?
Yeah.
Yes, it's true. Yeah, yeah. You should read my PhD thesis, Nana, if you haven't.
Thank you.
Thanks for the recommendation.
I don't think you need to read the entire dissertation, but maybe if you're interested in the ways that, you know, fathers sort of balance this these ideals of parenthood up against other ideals of soldiering or different understandings of masculinity, that's something, yeah, that I wrote about.
Cool. Thank you so much for that recommendation.
Haven't seen another hand, not an electronic one at least. Just scrolling.
But I'm thinking actually in extension of what Mike just said, and I have read your thesis. It's really good. It's really interesting. One of the things, of course, that I keep wondering about in my current job, and which I think you might also find interesting to sort of, is this question of whether I don't know, is it more legitimate to do, like, parenting is a gender neutral term, right? But is it perhaps more legitimate to do this long distance, whatever, mediatized parenting as a father than as a mother? I wonder. I remember one of the female soldiers I interviewed who told me about being deployed for she was away for 6 months in a row while she had two children who were both kindergarten age, right? And she told me how the other parents in the kindergarten would say to her kids, oh, such a pity for you, your mom's away for such a long time, right? And she was furious. And she said to me during the interview with me, she said, you know, would they have said that if it were their father? I mean, what's the sort of gendered, I mean, what are the gendered expectations around being, I mean, because even if we do see studies where this evidence that mediatized parenting can be a kind of proxy for some of these obligations or ideals we have about parenting, maybe it's also still a gendered sort of practice, or yeah.
Well, just breaking in there, now we will soon give the word to somebody else. But I mean, I think, Helene, those expectations we meet everywhere, also in scholarship, right? When we as young women, I need to go abroad for international stays or field work, and where there's a social expectation where it can be difficult. But also, I'm thinking that these things are not only social, these are also emotional, they are affective, and they are also, in a sense, very bodily, because of the very many ways that we relate with children, not just as this future that we have produced and now go, right? And I think those are dimensions that are interesting for us to explore. Let's do that in the future.
Still, I could join in right here on also saying that that I will embark on this right now. So going to do field work for 19 days away from my 3 small children. And I'm going to a place where I will definitely, and have been before, get numerous comments on how I can dare leave my children with a complete stranger, their father. So I do understand this, and then perhaps in this, because I'm thinking about this. You also mentioned this in your presentation, like this about this very complex term change, right? And I'm very interested in this term and how we explore this as scholars, right? And like, because we know that change is not like a static thing. We can't we can't observe it while it's happening, or we can't measure it until it has happened, kind of saying, okay, now it's this and this, and now it's that, and this was so 100 years ago, blah, blah, blah. So it's like fluid, fluctuous, and, all around, and it's molding, and it's subtle, and it's, all these things. And like how then we can, like when you're looking at these peripherals and coastal borders and stuff, like how, when, like, is it that you don't see it? Because you're saying, like, you're wondering, like, how can it, we know that it's ever changing, it's changing, and gender dynamics are changing, like how, but you can, you're kind of like, how is it not here? And like, how is it, are we looking at it at a, wrong way, or how can we explore something that isn't visible in this way? Kind of, I think that was a question.
Yeah, and I think it's really topical and a question, right? And it's difficult to grasp with. And I'm not into this research really in any sort of deep sense at all. But I'm sitting here thinking that I think maybe some of these questions about how can we grapple with change, how can we research change while it's ongoing, and not just observe it afterwards that something has changed, right? And I wonder if maybe part of it lies with this perspective of norm criticism, which I'm not really, I mean, I'm not super familiar with it myself, but I have some research acquaintances who are working especially in the fields of education, where they're trying to work with this concept of norm criticism and trying to look at the current, like the status quo, which is never quite quo, right? I mean, it's not always the same. Things are always changing, but trying to sort of ask questions to our sort of taken for grantedness, right? And I think actually, I mean, I'm not going to revolutionize the Danish defense at all, but I think that's part of actually what I'm doing right now with the kind of work, and also what they expect from me is to ask those kinds of questions, right? To look at things and say, why do you do this? Right? And often now I'm working in I have an employer that's been an organization for more than 500 years, right? It's insane how old they are, right? And some of their traditions are just like, and I just look at it and say, why do you do that, right? And I think that's part of the question, or part of perhaps the part of the inroad towards researching change while it's ongoing. I think perhaps, right? Asking those types of questions, right? Why do we do this? It would just be so cool if you could be the first fashion designer on Lesser, right? I mean, or whatever. Yeah. I'll pass the word on, I think, to Mai, perhaps, or maybe back to you too.
Yeah. So Mai, I can see your hand.
Yeah, I think I have a quick I don't know if it's more of a comment than a question really, but listen, thank you also for your presentation, Helene. It was really inspiring, and it had me thinking that that when we talk about place, and maybe that's also because what I'm interested in at the moment, I have sort of I'm trying to develop a project where I am exploring what it means to be a momfluencer. So and it has got me reading a lot about this idea of retreatism, right? Of sort of women getting back into the home and sort of doing all these domestic chores and raising children and also caring for them at home, and for some of them this also means homeschooling and or at least taking care of their children while they're small, not sending them into daycare institutions. But what I find interesting about these women is that they somehow still seem to work, but just not in the traditional sense, because they work online. So they earn money from their profile content, right, on social media. And this has meant, at least that's a sort of a tendency that I see, that you can live anywhere and do this kind of work. So I don't know, probably many of you know the Aarhus Manifesto. And although I don't think that's very representative, but it still somehow signals some kind of, maybe, I don't know, new tendency for people to move back to the countryside, because you can actually work from home or from anywhere because of social media or more generally the internet. But I don't know if it's a comment, I think, because we haven't talked about that or touched upon it, the ways that sort of influence also maybe island culture in general. Yeah.
I think I was actually thinking of this as well, like because I was also thinking about like I don't remember, maybe you guys know the statistics, but so I just heard these statistics on like out migration from Copenhagen, especially, and there's like the only reason why we're like upholding a stable population in Copenhagen, or perhaps also like other large cities, I'm not sure, was because of like people moving, like foreigners moving to Copenhagen, because otherwise, if that hadn't been, then we would see like an out migration of Copenhagen. So these are like kind of in these lines, because we see it in different, in like all like many different places, like how, you know, people are, you know, quiet quitting, and you know, these different like alternative you know, lives and family lives and, you know, and intimate lives, and like are happening. And like, and I, you know, and this is not just statistical, but like I know also people who move to like lesser and other different like islands, and you know, make a winery, or you know, do something, you know, or like, yeah, live off be an Instagrammer, or like cook and yeah, and influencer. Yeah, of course. I'm sorry, I'm very like strangely old in that way. I know, no, yeah, my body is not old, but my mind is. And so like, what about those, you know, those who like immigrate to these islands? Like, what, you know, is there any different to these? What is the difference between these people who come to these islands and want to, you know, they are in the age of raising children, getting children, and you know, and or making a family, but are they different? Do they lack the home part that you're also talking about, Helene? Like because something is happening there, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm sitting here trying to scroll my mind, but I can't remember it. But okay, I published an article fall 2022, but I can't remember the journal name, where I actually discussed that, right? But not necessarily so much the question you just raised, but a tendency I've seen in research, which I think is interesting, that there's been a lot of research on these types of people, right? These um, what are they called? They're called counter-urbanites, right? That's what the research term is, right? The counter-urbanites who are really sort of moving out from Copenhagen or other sort of urban hubs to try and create sort of new, sort of fashionable types of income. And I've actually, in that article, I'm quite critical of the researchers who research that, not to say that it's not a thing and it's not a phenomenon, but to say that I think there's been a tendency in some of that. I mean, you can be forgiven for reading that type of research and then think, okay, it's because it's only people who come from urban places who are innovative and can think of new ways of making money, right? I mean, there's something to that type of research which somehow puts these people on a pedestal without really critically engaging with, so what is the sort of endogenous sort of self creating new inventions coming out of these small places, right? So in that article, I tried to show that, yes, that's definitely a thing. It's happening. But it doesn't mean that people living in small places aren't themselves also contributing to this trend. And neither does it mean that they're not interacting, right? And actually, there's some evidence, rather to the contrary, especially some research from Canada, that may indicate that people who move out from urban centers to create jobs and new sort of ventures in more peripheral areas, that perhaps they sometimes generate more income and networks and profit, both in a social and sort of capitalistic kind of sense, for themselves and their old networks from the urban centers rather than for the local environment. I think that's a really interesting debate, right? And then, of course, the whole question then arises, then how is this related to ideals about the good life, especially in terms of raising a family, parenting, and there's some mixed evidence. Some of the Danish research, I'm thinking, what's her name? There's a Danish geographer who's written about this. I forget her name. But she seems to show that although some of these counter-urbanites are successful in a sort of working life kind of sense, they feel less successful in becoming integrated in the social texture of the local place. So moving from an urban place and doing some hipster whatever thing there, earning a living from being a momfluencer, that was new to me, but yeah, I get the point. It's not necessarily the same as being becoming socially integrated in this new place or whatever. I mean, and neither should I should underscore, neither does actually growing up in a place like that and becoming a momfluencer while originating from that place. I mean, and sometimes, you can forgive the research literature for you. I mean, you can read it as if, it's either or, right? And I think there's too much. Yeah, I was really critical in that article. I think there's too much black and white in that whole literature. Not, turning a blind eye to the innovation taking place out of these small peripheral communities, but also perhaps overestimating the social integration or impact of these people. I mean, sometimes there's some research from Canada showing how in effect some of these companies that are then driven by these ex-urbanites end up being isolated little enclaves, not really integrated in the local economy, neither the capital economy or the social economy of the local place, right? So
definitely. Well, we are definitely reaching also an end, have passed that. And quickly, I want to thank everyone on behalf of our whole team for attending today. And we hope that you will join our next webinar also on the 25th. We haven't planned it yet, but it will be spicy and good as well. But please also let us know if you want anyone else to get, if you know someone else who wants direct information from us about the webinars, please share, distribute widely, so we can get this, so it can flourish. But thank you, and thank you so much, Helene, to you, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks for today.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.